Buenas tardes, selamat siang, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie, and I'm on the ISTF panel's organizing team. I'm a first-year Master of Environmental Management candidate here at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Welcome to our final plenary panel of ISTF, titled Journalism in the Tropics, Telling Stories of Resistance and Repair. Over the last couple of days, you've heard from restoration ecologists, political ecologists, community activists, and artists. And you've also heard that successful restoration of our degraded landscapes, forests, and environment will need to be accompanied by awareness, mobilization, and action from a broader base. It is from this spirit and belief that this panel was born. As an engine of investigation and the first line of communication with the public, journalists have a powerful role to play in shaping the narrative and influencing action around tropical forests, highlighting intersections with indigenous rights, development, and corruption. In this panel, we ask, what is the role of reporting in protecting forests, addressing climate change, keeping science relevant, and shifting culture and politics? How do we look at old issues like deforestation and restoration in new ways? How can storytelling shape the narrative in a way that drives action and impact? 3 reporters and a lawyer who dedicated their careers to approaching these questions and covering tropical forests will discuss their research methods, observations from the ground, and the kind of stories that work. But before we kick off the panel, I have a quick housekeeping announcement. For this panel, we are offering simultaneous translation services via the Interprify app. I'll pause for a minute to give those of you who have not yet downloaded this app to do so and to set it up on your phones. Thank you for all of your cooperation. To start things off, I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator, a friend of ISTF and an alum, Nora Moraga Louie. Nora is the Rainforest Journalism Fund Manager at the Pulitzer Center. Through this initiative, Nora has the privilege of working with journalists who report stories and issues related to the environment in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia. Prior to joining the Pulitzer Center, Nora worked at the Environmental Law Institute, where she coordinated the Environmental Peacebuilding Program and managed the first UN Environment Report on the Environmental Rule of Law. She holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Yale College and an MEM from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Nora, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us right after lunch. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to start out with a few introductions of the folks who will be sharing their stories with us and explaining what it's like to be a journalist and storyteller reporting on these very important issues. So I'm going to start off with Aisha Llewellyn, who's a former diplomat and a British journalist of 5 years, based in Medan, North Sumatra in Indonesia. She's the deputy editor for New Narrative and has written for The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the South China Morning Post, the Lowy Institute, and Asia Times. She holds a BA in Indonesian from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. She's fluent in Bahasa Indonesia, and she writes primarily about Indonesian politics and human rights. And then next we have Nelly Luna Amancio. She's an investigative journalist specializing in stories on the environment, human rights, and corporate power. She's the founder and editor at Ojo Publico, an investigative media in Peru, and it's widely read and referenced throughout Latin America. Nelly Luna participated in the Panama Papers investigation, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 2017. And with her leadership, Ojo Publico has developed several cross-border investigation projects on environmental crimes that have also received national and international awards. So Nelly is a member also of the advisory committee of the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Journalism Fund, which is how I had the honor of meeting her and Pablo last year. And I'll introduce Pablo next. Pablo Alvarenga is a National Geographic explorer and a Pulitzer Center grantee as well. He's a documentary photographer, cinematographer, and visual storyteller looking at human rights issues throughout Latin America and focusing on Brazil. He's dedicated his work to studying and photographing land conflicts and the ongoing process of colonization that continues to affect traditional populations throughout Latin America. So he covers topics related to the development of agriculture, extensive infrastructure projects, and more. You can, I guess, find some of their social media information on their slides, and I encourage you to follow them because they have a lot of amazing work that they continue to do. And I guess at this point, each of these speakers is going to have about 15 minutes to present their work, and then maybe I'll open with a few questions, but I would definitely appreciate it if you all made my job easier, so jot down ideas or questions that you have for them, and there will definitely be time for that at the end. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Pablo.
Do I have to open the...
Oh, I have another introduction. I'm sorry. On the back page. This is our exception to the rule. He's actually a lawyer who's joined us and has worked for a long time with Aisha Llewellyn and New Narrative. I'm so sorry. Pardon. So we have Ranto Siwarani, who is a human rights lawyer based also in Medan, Indonesia. He's worked there for over 10 years. Managing on the management board of Contra S in North Sumatra, which is the Commission for Disappeared Peoples and Victims of Violence. He's experienced in social and humanitarian work, and he's been active in the North Sumatra provincial legislature as well. He's as an expert in law and government. So he has, as I mentioned, been working with Aisha Llewellyn on investigating human rights and environmental abuses in Indonesia generally. And now I'll turn it over to Pablo. Sorry.
Well, hi. When I got invited to talk in this conference, in this panel, I was thinking, what can I bring interesting here? And I was thinking, do I have to show pictures? Do I have to show some videos? And then I found out that maybe I can talk about my experiences on the field. And I'm really interested in talking about assumptions and about stereotypes, and how we, from outside the Amazon, look at the Amazon. So I started to think, what examples do I have to share with you? And I realized that the best example was my experience, was about me, because I was the first in conceiving the Amazon and the indigenous peoples in a way that it wasn't it doesn't meet what I found on the field. So in 2016, I was in the Montevideo Photography School in Uruguay, and I was taking a class of documentary photographer, and my teacher started to show us a story that he has shot like 25 years ago about indigenous in Paraguay, Papa de Guarani and Via Indigenous. And I can't forget what I felt in that moment, because I was like astounded by those images, because there was a huge collision between the images that I was looking at and the images that I grew up looking at. I come from a country that totally denied its origin, its indigenous origins, its roots. It's a country where 1/3 of the population has indigenous ancestry, but actually we don't tell this to our students. So these indigenous, through all our educational system, they were featured as, well, first extinct, and then with images like these ones, when they are pictured naked, running on the forest and being pictured as wild people, as savage people. And something really interesting also is that they were pictured as some people that doesn't respect our culture. So we are stepping in a most important place again regarding that. So this is one of the pictures that my teacher showed us, and I was completely confused because this is not the image that I used to have about how an indigenous should look like. This is a man with Western clothes, with a watch, with an English bicycle there. That was really confusing. So I went back home like feeling really, really confused, but also really curious. And I opened my computer and I started to look for images or information about indigenous right now, and my astonishment and confusion and curiosity only grow up. Because I found now like moving images in color with sound about indigenous today, and the most surprising thing was not only about how indigenous should look like, or how they look like today,
não é só branco que tem direito, não, índio Carvalho tem direito também para procurar. Quantas pessoas que morreram, matamos o São Fernando, quantas pessoas que mataram Alzina e Pistoleiro, 9 pessoas, né? Deixa nós ficar aqui, eu não vou me embora, nem jogar tudo não. Para isso nós temos que ter coragem, eu vou voltar de novo não ter coragem.
In each country, where stories like this don't cross the border. So I learned about this because I was interested and I was looking at it. In Uruguay, we don't know anything about Brazil unless it's a huge dam that's collapsing and it's an environmental crisis, or if Bolsonaro is involved with something. So I decided to make some local context, and I did my first trip to tell my first indigenous story. And I traveled to Mato Grosso do Sul, which is the most violent state in Brazil regarding to indigenous. And this was like a really life-changing experience, because all the things that I was reading at my home in a warm coach, then I was like having real contact with these situations on the field. And this was like a life-changing experience, and I said, okay, I want to dedicate my work to follow these issues. And since then I've done at least 20 stories about traditional populations fighting extractivism, mostly in Brazil, but also in Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. I've been both in pristine rainforests and also in those places where the rainforest has completely vanished, to open door to soybean fields that extend to the horizon. So one of the biggest findings to me is that photography and storytelling can't change these hard realities. And but I learned also that maybe storytelling and photography could be a bridge that connect two different societies, the non-indigenous society and the indigenous society, in a different way, because when we connect, it's about assumptions, about stereotypes, as we do with these populations, and also to get their natural resources in order to make money. So what I realized is that, to me, it wasn't about the rainforest, it wasn't about conservation, it wasn't about restoration. To me, it turns a matter of human rights, a matter of people. Because there's a genocide against indigenous peoples taking place in Brazil. Indigenous are being killed. And one great thing to tell you is that the Amazon is not only a bunch of trees that produces oxygen for us to breathe. There's 30 million people living in the Amazon. And they are being threatened, they are being killed, they are being persecuted by police, by the government, by landowners, or hired militias that are hired to shoot on these people. And to give you some numbers about how this conflict looks like, from 2003 to 2019, more than 1,200 indigenous were killed directly or indirectly for this conflict, and more than 800 indigenous committed suicides, when 20% of these are kids between 5 and 14 years old. So it's a really hard situation, the one that they are facing. So as someone who works on the field and who has all their senses on the field, to me it's kind of selfish from our part, from the Westerns, to think in the Amazon and the only thing that we see sometimes, it's that are the lungs of the earth. This is one common phrase that I'm sure that all of you have heard. And the event that gathered to me all these stereotypes, all these assumptions about the Amazon was the Amazon fires. And I was in Brazil when the Amazon fire started when it started. And they started like 15, the Amazon was burning for 15 days. And then
Ainda mais, às 4 da tarde, o Globocop fez esses registros. A cidade completamente escura e encoberta. Luz apenas dos faróis dos carros.
Um colega de trabalho brincou dizendo que era...
So at that point, big media started to take into consideration what was happening in the Amazon, and they said, okay, this is important, so we need to cover it. And from that moment, what happened was like everybody was engaged and everybody was trying to talk about the Amazon. But what I realized, me who work with people in the Amazon, is that everyone was concerned about the oxygen, everyone was concerned about the trees, everyone was concerned about all those species that wasn't discovered to science, to our science. So again, it's a kind of selfish. And all these assumptions gathering images like this one, with a hashtag pray for the Amazon, with African elephants, which are not on the Amazon. So to me it was like sort of strong, because we are not caring about people. It's like my house set on fire and people is concerned about my home and not about my family. So I did some sort of really easy research in Google and looked for Amazon fires, because the only images that I saw from this event were pristine forests being burned, and then I saw like something like pristine forest being burned, and I think there were more pictures also of pristine forest being burned. There was the only narrative. And I know that this make all the world to be concerned about this, because it's important to us, but we're still thinking in ourselves. And sort of funny, the only people that was shown in these pictures were white firemen who were fighting this fire. It's okay to show that, it's part of the story, but again, we are not focusing on the traditional populations that live there. So I think that this is what we call like colonization through image. We create our own a single narrative that goes over all the other narratives that there exist. So I think that as image producers, as media outlets, we have a responsibility, a huge responsibility of teaching people what they should be concerned about, and not only giving to them the things that we think that they need. For example, showing images of trees burning. I remember when I was in school, my teacher showed us a text, and we had like an entire class to address deforestation in the Amazon. And she said something like, I can't remember the number right now, but something that during each day, a lot of soccer fields are burned, are deforested in the Amazon. And you can't imagine how big this is until you are there. And it's not only about trees. In this place, there's a lot of communities living. So what I've seen in the field is that there's like 3 stages of deforestation. The first one is when they take the most precious trees. And just a tiny story here. Let's say that there's an inspector and whose work is to go to the rainforest, so a part that they are going to deforest and legally. And he said, okay, here there are 150 of these precious trees. But there's actually 5, not 150. So you might be thinking, how do they get the rest of the trees? Well, they get it from indigenous territories, they get it from lands, from reservations, or from places that they shouldn't. And then they get this wood to the facilities. They get 150 trunks, and with this paper that said these trunks come from this place, so everything is okay. And these tables, this wood is now becoming tables, fancy rare tables in Europe with woods chopped down in the Amazon. The second is when they they chop down the rest of the trees that are useful, but not as valuable as the first ones. And the third one is that they chop down everything else, and they do it like this. So it's really fast. And it's important to address this because there's a lot of great scientists thinking great solutions and the most effective solutions to restore these places. But it's not
Arranca com tudo, Rosa. Arranca com tudo.
It takes time and it takes a lot of time to redo it. So spending all this time with indigenous made me realize that it's about how we relate with the territory. And while I was in the national occupations of indigenous in Brasilia, where they gathered like 4,000 indigenous to protest for what they are facing in the field, I saw a conversation between kids, and I love how kids make complex things really simple. So there was like 2 little brothers in something like a street market where indigenous were selling goods or something, and there was like an indigenous kid with his mother selling some fruits from the land. And the 2 little kids, like 5 years old, one of them said, "Hey, where does all these fruits come from?" And he said, "Well, from the supermarket." And the indigenous girl said, "No, they come from my land." She was like offended. So this tiny story illustrates how we relate with the territories and how they relate with the territories. We don't know where the things that we consume come from. And we find success in conquering new spaces. I mean, we dream with having these sort of buildings in Mars, and we are not actually caring about what's happening in our land. And to them, those territories are sacred because below their feet, hundreds of generations of ancestors still rest. So there's 2 worlds that are colliding. And as a storyteller, we wanted to address these stories, to tell personal stories, to tell stories about people in the Amazon. And with a friend who's called Francesc, who's a Mexican journalist, we started a project that's called Rainforest Defenders, in which we tried to tell the stories of the people in the Amazon. And as a photographer, I found this was a great opportunity to try a new idea of telling the link between people and the land. So I started by photographing them from the air, laying down on their territories. And then I showed another picture of their territories from a much higher altitude, trying to reveal what's happening there, what are they facing. So she's Rita, she's a Quilombola. She's considered Quilombolas are traditional populations of Brazil. And she was the first woman in being elected as the coordinator of the 5 territories that she represents. And next to their territory is a huge bauxite mine. That square is like 1 mile by 1 mile. And inside there's like a huge mine that's 20 by 20 to give some scale. So he's William, he's fighting the effects of a new road that's breaking through their territory. But there's not only about people defending the rainforest. For example, she was the first indigenous woman in addressing gender violence issue, and she started empowering other women to fight against violence. So we understood that the territory that she defends is not about only about the rainforest, but also about the indigenous body. His ethne is fighting illegal loggers that are chopping down trees on his sacred land in Brazil. And these are 26 huge trunks, like 1 or 2 meters diameter, that they managed to recover. She's Dani, who lives in a reservation that's surrounded by soybean fields. So, and we did a lot of stories like this. So, what I want you to think from now on is that the Amazon is not only a bunch of trees that produce oxygen to us. We can do much better. And I'm not inventing this, I'm sitting on the field. Thank you.
And Nelly Luna Mancia will be presenting next, so I encourage those of you who downloaded the app and need translation services from Spanish to English to start listening.
Buenas tardes. Quiero agradecer la invitación para compartir un poco la experiencia que tenemos en el equipo de Ojo Público. Es un medio digital dedicado a la investigación periodística. Acabamos de cumplir 5 años y uno de los temas que más estamos investigando son los crímenes ambientales en la Amazonía. Bien. Ojo Público es un medio que apareció hace 5 años y uno de los temas que más estamos investigando tiene que ver con los crímenes ambientales en la Amazonía. Escucho la traducción, pero bueno, bien. A ver. Quería comenzar con esta imagen, retomando un poco lo que decía Pablo, que muchos asumimos que la Amazonía, como cualquier otro bosque, es un refugio paradisíaco lleno de animales a los que hay que proteger porque son bonitos, sin saber o sin entender que hay población que depende de la existencia de estos bosques. Y bajo esa lógica, durante muchísimos años, se ha extraído recursos naturales de la Amazonía, ¿no? Se ha extraído madera, se extrae oro, se extrae otras cantidades de recursos. Entonces, pero lo que pocos sabemos es que lo que se extrae de ahí genera una corriente financiera que está relacionada a esta imagen, ¿no? ¿Saben qué es? Puede ser cualquier isla paradisíaca, ¿no? Esta en particular son las Islas Vírgenes Británicas, ¿no? Un paraíso fiscal donde se concentran gran cantidad de compañías offshore, ¿no? Y esta imagen paradisíaca tiene que ver con esta otra. Esta imagen es una toma aérea de la zona de minería ilegal en Perú, en el corazón de la Amazonía peruana, en la región de Madre de Dios, desde donde hace más de 25 años se viene extrayendo oro. Un oro que al final termina exportándose de manera legal por compañías legales que forman parte del London Bullion Market, ¿no? Esta compañía que vemos acá. El London Bullion Market es un gremio que agrupa las principales compañías del oro, las que fijan, por ejemplo, el precio del oro en el mundo. Y gran parte de estas empresas son las que durante los últimos 10 años han financiado y comprado el oro que sale de este lugar, ¿no? Sucede en Perú, pero sucede también con el oro colombiano, con el oro boliviano, el oro de Brasil, de Ecuador y de Venezuela, que son extraídos de manera ilegal, entre un 10 y 20% más o menos, dependiendo de cada país, ¿no? Y ese oro lo que genera, además de la gran cantidad de deforestación, es otros delitos conexos, ¿no? Otros tipos de delitos relacionados, desde el sicariato. Por ejemplo, si uno va a esta zona de descampadas de minería ilegal, es común ver dos cosas, ¿no? Además de la desolación y la devastación, lo que se encuentra son con tumbas, ¿no? Tumbas de este tipo, donde son enterradas las personas luego de ser asesinadas. En particular esta, por ejemplo, lleva el nombre de la víctima, pero en muchos otros casos las cruces ni siquiera llevan nombres porque no se sabe quién ha sido la víctima. También uno encuentra restos de estos como especie de cilindros, repositorios donde se trasladan los minerales, ¿no? En los campamentos también hay prostitución, trata de personas, trata de menores, que son explotados laboral y sexualmente. Esta imagen, por ejemplo, corresponde a uno de estos centros que son llamados prostibares, son como bares donde se ha especializado, donde el crimen se ha especializado para traficar con menores de edad, y se construyen pequeñas habitaciones de plástico, madera, y las van enumerando a donde son llevadas las mujeres explotadas, ¿no? Todo en los mismos campamentos. Okay. Y es aquí donde quería detallar un poco, ¿no? Que el oro finalmente que es extraído de la Amazonía sudamericana tiene un destino, ¿no? O sea, no es un destino, no todo el oro termina en las bodegas o de los bancos. Gran parte de ese oro termina en grandes, importantes productoras de oro para joyería, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y llega hasta ese punto porque existe un sistema que hasta el momento le permite legalizar, lavar, decimos, como cuando se lava el dinero del narcotráfico. Existe un sistema muy similar que está permitiendo que durante los últimos años los recursos extraídos ilegalmente de la Amazonía sudamericana terminen incorporándose a un sistema formal, un sistema legal en donde ya es imposible, en muchos casos, criminalizar. Porque ¿quién va a decir, por ejemplo, en algún momento que el London Bullion Market es una organización criminal? Nadie lo puede decir porque es una organización con sede reconocida, que cumple estándares muy formales en el papel. Sin embargo, los intermediarios o muchos de los que forman parte de esta organización han terminado comprando oro proveniente de la extracción ilegal, ¿no? Y además, la otra parte es que muchas de estas empresas terminan también utilizando compañías de fachada, compañías offshore, que desde las Islas Vírgenes Británicas o desde otras sedes terminan ingresando el dinero que es generado por la exportación de este oro extraído de zonas que generan altas tasas de deforestación y perjuicios como el que les he mostrado. Esta, por ejemplo, es uno de los reportajes que publicamos con los Panama Papers, donde aparecían algunas de estas compañías que al final creaban cuentas en las Islas Vírgenes Británicas para depositar los ingresos provenientes de la venta del oro de origen ilegal, ¿no? Y ustedes se preguntarán, ¿quiénes son estas empresas, no? Yo les he mencionado el London Bullion Market, pero cuando uno empieza a ver, eso fue parte de una investigación que hicimos entre el 2015 y el 2016, estas empresas que compran el oro provenían hasta hace 2 años de 2 sedes muy importantes. Estados Unidos, a través de las refinerías ubicadas en Miami, y Suiza, ¿no? En los últimos 3 años ha habido un esfuerzo por reducir la compra de este oro sucio. Incluso una de las investigaciones que más tiempo nos ha tomado generó que incluso en Estados Unidos una de las empresas sea investigada, ¿no? Esa empresa al final fue clausurada, el FBI le abrió una investigación y ha dejado desapareció. Fue tan fuerte el proceso que le abrieron en Estados Unidos que se dio por quebrada y cerrada. El problema está en que apareció otra, ¿no? Y el crimen, o en este caso los negocios poco éticos, funcionan de esa forma. Uno lucha contra una organización o contra una compañía que tiene malas prácticas, pero luego, si es que la demanda persiste, vuelve a aparecer otra. Entonces, lo que yo quería por eso enfocar un poco esta presentación en cuán necesario es que las investigaciones periodísticas, la investigación de la sociedad civil, incluso desde la academia, tome en cuenta la necesidad de establecer cadenas de suministro más claras, ¿no? Porque gran parte de los recursos naturales extraídos ilegalmente de la Amazonía terminan de una u otra forma incorporándose en un sistema legal, ¿no? Que tiene una estructura legal que les permite exportar, reexportar en otros casos, y que llegue al consumidor, que somos nosotros, sin la debida información, ¿no? Nosotros creemos que si una persona tuviera información de que en este celular está compuesto por muchos de los minerales que son extraídos de zonas de violencia, de zonas de deforestación, el consumidor podría definir un consumo más responsable. Pero esa información no la tenemos. Entonces, el objetivo del periodismo de estos años debería ser también visibilizar, identificar cuáles son estas empresas cuyas prácticas no toman en cuenta que el producto que están comprando provienen de zonas con sangre o con zonas que están generando violencia, con zonas que no se están respetando los derechos humanos, como lo que viene ocurriendo en la Amazonía. El ejemplo del oro es uno, ¿no? Pero lo mismo ocurre con los árboles, ¿no? Las piezas maderables más caras son extraídas también de manera ilegal. Un estudio de la FAO, del Programa de Alimentos y Bosques de Naciones Unidas, estableció hace unos años que más del 60% de la madera que se comercializaba en el mundo era ilegal, ¿no? Ahora no se sabe, pero es un número bastante elevado. ¿Dónde va esa madera, ¿no? Hicimos un ejercicio similar al que se trabajó con el oro, y lo que encontramos es que si bien durante los últimos años la demanda de madera amazónica se ha reducido en Estados Unidos, quien ha reemplazado esa demanda es China, ¿no? Y China es uno de los países que más recursos naturales está demandando en los últimos años, y es el territorio en el que es más difícil investigar, ¿no? Por la poca transparencia de la información. En este mapa bueno, es un... Okay. les muestro un poco. Es un mapa interactivo donde se trasladaron todos los datos vinculados a los países que demandan la madera, ¿no? Y ahí está, ok. Por ejemplo, esta es la madera que sale de Perú y podemos ver a dónde va, ¿no? Va algo a Unión Europea, algo a Estados Unidos. Lo mismo podemos hacer con Brasil, ¿no? O Bolivia, o Colombia, en fin. Son los principales destinos. Visibilizar la demanda es uno de los temas más importantes para los próximos, años. ¿A quién no le gustaría saber de dónde proviene incluso otro tipo de metales que se necesitan, ¿no? Uy. Estamos de cabeza. Solo volver al... No, volvamos a la presentación. Ok. Sí. No más. Okay. Y en esta parte del crecimiento, lo que sí hemos notado en casi todas las investigaciones de extracción de recursos es el crecimiento de la demanda china, no solamente en recursos naturales, sino también en algún tipo de especies, ¿no? Por ejemplo, las aletas de tiburón, ¿no? Las aletas de tiburón es otro de los recursos que tienen mucha demanda y que en los últimos 5 años nos ha explotado como un gran tema en la parte costera, tanto de Ecuador y de Perú, por el alto tráfico que existe. Y cierro con esta parte. Pablo decía algo muy interesante que yo sí siento que es parte de una narrativa que no es la sudamericana, sino es una narrativa más global, ¿no? De que los bosques son importantes porque garantizan la supervivencia de la humanidad, lo cual es cierto, pero esa narrativa silencia a las poblaciones locales, ¿no? Y la visión que estas comunidades originarias tienen del uso del territorio y tienen de lo que quieren para el futuro. Él es Edwin Chota, ¿no? Un líder Ashénica que fue asesinado junto a otros 3 en la frontera de Perú y Brasil. Fue asesinado hace 6 años, su cuerpo fue encontrado, pero el de los otros 2 no, porque él venía denunciando a una de las mafias más fuertes que tiene la Amazonía, la mafia del tráfico de madera, ¿no? Y los asesinos de este grupo de indígenas los secuestraron, los asesinaron, los descuartizaron, los quemaron y desaparecieron sus restos, tanto así que solo se pudo encontrar de 2 de ellos. Y desde ese momento hasta ahora, ni Brasil ni Perú han logrado condenar a los asesinos, ni siquiera, además, sancionar la denuncia por tala ilegal que ellos habían establecido por primera vez el 2008. ¿No? Y ellos nos enseñan algo, ¿no? Ellos, por ejemplo, son son pueblos indígenas en aislamiento voluntario. En el caso de Edwin Chota, era una comunidad reconocida, instalada, con registros, pero la parte de la Amazonía peruana y brasileña también tiene poblaciones que han decidido el aislamiento voluntario, ¿no? Grupos de personas que han decidido no tener contacto con nuestra sociedad. Y a ellos también todos los problemas que ya les hemos relatado los afectan. Pero como no tienen una voz, nadie prácticamente les consulta y solamente se convierten en víctimas silenciosas de todo el entorno que estamos destruyendo. Y en los últimos años lo que se ha visto tanto en Perú como en Brasil es que estos pueblos en aislamiento voluntario permanentemente están ahora saliendo y acechando a otras comunidades. y las acechan porque las rutas que tenían de desplazamientos, que antes eran protegidas o aisladas, ahora ya no lo son. O sea, ya no existe en este momento ninguna zona virgen de la Amazonía. O sea, casi toda la Amazonía ha sido recorrida o por los madereros ilegales, o por los mineros, o por las mafias del narcotráfico, que son otras de las grandes mafias que se están instalando cada vez con mayor fuerza para sembrar cultivos de coca ilegal en esta parte de los bosques. Y esa violencia en la que se toman los territorios de estas comunidades es la que los está obligando cada vez a salir más. Y eso es lo que se nota en la frontera de Perú y Brasil, ¿no? Y problemas similares ocurren en otras partes de las fronteras de Perú con Colombia, de Colombia con Brasil. Toda la franja fronteriza que comparte Brasil con los países andinos es en este momento una de las zonas de mayor delictividad y de mayor violencia, no solamente para las poblaciones indígenas, sino también para otros grupos de pobladores que están habitando esos espacios. Y ninguno de los países tiene protocolos o normas de intervención en la zona que permitan luchar contra ese tipo de crímenes, ¿no? Solo para que tengan una idea, la persecución del delito en Brasil es completamente distinta a la del Perú es distinta a la de Colombia. Entonces, lo que suele ocurrir es que estas fronteras se convierten en prácticamente territorios no controlados, ¿no? Termino con esta aplicación. Si ustedes, les invito a ingresar al sitio de Ojo Público, es ojo-público.com. Esta es una herramienta que nos permite ver cómo la deforestación por minería ilegal está destruyendo uno de los bosques más biodiversos del Perú, que es la reserva del Tambopata, que empieza en este lado. Este río es la frontera de la reserva y miren lo cercano que están los mineros. Todo esto rojo es la minería ilegal, ¿no? Y lo que podemos ver, si uno compara e ingresa a la aplicación, es cuánto se ha deforestado en comparación a, ¿no? Esta dimensión amarilla que ustedes ven aquí es la dimensión del Central Park, ¿no? Pero también podemos ver cuánto en comparación al centro de París o al de otros sitios que son muy visitados, para tener una idea de la dimensión de lo que se ha devastado solamente por la extracción de un oro que termina en un sistema formal ilegal, a vista y paciencia de todos nosotros, ¿no? Yo termino con eso. Muchas gracias por mi tiempo.
Thank you very much, Nelly. And next we have Ranto Siwarani and Aisha Llewellyn, who will be presenting on New Narrative.
I'm not sure quite how it's going to work because there's two of us, sorry, and I don't really want to stand up. So am I good to just sit here? Here, yes. It's just this one? Got it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the challenges and dangers of journalism in Indonesia, of which there are many. For years, I didn't touch environmental journalism, and I write about many things. Terrorism is one of them. I regularly hang out with mass murderers, people who've committed and plotted these awful crimes, and I would rather do that, honestly, than report on the environment. It really is that bad in Indonesia. So for years, I didn't touch looking at anything that had to do with the environment. And then more recently, I've started to do it. We're going to talk about the different platforms that we work for. One of them is New Narrative, and we actually have a table set up outside if you want to come up afterwards and ask us about New Narrative. We have our book and information about what we do. So this is one platform that we write for. So you can ask us about that later. But we write for lots of different publications about the environment. This is a good example of why it's so dangerous to write about the environment in Indonesia, or to be involved in it really in any way. The man that you see here with the megaphone is Golfrid Sirega. He was an environmental lawyer who was found dead recently in very kind of suspicious circumstances, and we reported on his case. He was, well, found dead in suspicious circumstances in October 2019. At the end of that month, 2 environmental activists were hacked to death in an oil palm plantation, also in North Sumatra, where we're based. At the beginning of 2019, one of Golfrid's colleagues in Sulawesi, his house was set on fire with him and his children and his wife inside it. So this just gives you kind of an example of how dangerous it can be to report on the environment in Indonesia. And you're the lawyer, so why would you say why is the environment such a particularly, do you think, contentious topic? I mean, there's lots of reasons, but in a nutshell, sorry.
Thank you. First, sorry if my English is not very good, because that English is not my mother language. My mother language is Batak, Bahasa. But I believe if I study here in Yale University, maybe 2 or 3 years, my English will be better. Yeah, I'll talk about the environment or forest. Why it's so dangerous in Indonesia? Because forest and environment is related to capital. So it's related to business. And like in Brazil and Nelly said, the owner of the business is a powerful people in Indonesia. So if we talk about forest environment, of course we talk about the damage, what the impact damage by the company corporation. So it will disturb the powerful people. So if we write article, or if you are journalism and write about environment and forest in Indonesia, it will be dangerous. But I want to tell you the important thing is, sometimes the forest issue not very interesting for the people here. For example, if we read the news, what happened when a woman, the blasphemy case, when a woman sue, she is make a blasphemy in one religion in Indonesia. All the journalists write about it. But if one indigenous people died because they try to fight for their land or their forest, it's not so interesting issue with the worldwide journalism. So this is the problem sometimes. If indigenous people die because they fight for their land or their forest, not very important to write about it. And but if issue about blasphemy on other things is more interest with the journalism. And why it's so dangerous to write about the forest and environment in Indonesia? Because the business now over there is make profit from the unsure of the law over there. So because the law is not, many of the law are not clear which one is the government make to manage the forest and environment. This is used by the businessmen to take advantage of it, to take profit, more profit. Because of that, it's so dangerous, because the government also in the side of the businessmen.
Yes.
Yeah, the same issue, talk about the forest, environment, also in the cycle of corruption, nepotism, and also
violence.
Yeah, violence, like that. So, yeah, as a lawyer, if I, in the court, in the side of the indigenous people, it's more difficult to win of the case in the court. If I am in the side of the indigenous people who fight for their land or for their forest. But if I were in the company side, it will easy, because it will talk about the money and nepotism and also the others. Yeah. So maybe the challenge is for.
Sorry, I just want to go back to what you said about the blasphemy case, because just to explain about the blasphemy, you were talking about the blasphemy case. That's actually how Ranto and I met, which will become relevant in a minute. So Ranto had a case which was a blasphemy case, because we still prosecute blasphemy in Indonesia. It was about a woman who was Buddhist. Her name's Meliana, and she made a comment about the volume of the mosque speakers where she lived in Tanjung Balai. And that story became a huge story. You defended Meliana. She got, 18 months it was in prison just for that comment, which was never proven. But it's interesting that you said just now that for you, that was such a massive story, right, internationally. So many people heard about it. And I actually covered that story, which is how we met. But I think it's interesting to look at that alongside something like Gulfrid, where it's as big a story, but internationally this did not get anything like that kind of reaction. And so when you're covering the environment, I think what you're saying is there's kind of less reward for it in a way, in that you're taking a really big risk to report on an environmental issue, which actually then can be really difficult to sell to an outlet, or people are just not as interested in environmental issues when, the risk is just a lot higher to you. Would that be right? Yeah. What you were saying? Okay, so to move into that, this is a story that we wrote together. I wrote it and you edited it. This is our own newsletter that we have, which is called Hukum, which means law in Indonesian. And again, if you want to know how to sign up or you want to ask about Hukum, you can ask us at the end of this session. So this is actually like a really interesting story. I wrote this about Indonesia's capital. So Indonesia's capital at the moment is in Jakarta, and it's moving to Kalimantan because Jakarta is sinking and is like ravaged by pollution and completely overpopulated. So to solve the problem, they're moving the capital to pristine Kalimantan, taking 1.5 million people with them at a cost of $3 billion to make things better, I guess. So I was commissioned to write this story because obviously it's a huge story about the environment by, I'm not going to name the publication, but a big international publication with a lot of money. They sent me to Kalimantan to do the story, and they wanted some kind of behind the scenes of like what the impact of this was going to be. And so what I found out was that actually the site of the new capital in East Kalimantan is linked to a number of senior political and military figures in Indonesia. So Prabowo Subianto, who was just ran in the presidential election, he lost, but he's been a senior figure in Indonesian politics for years. He was once denied a visa to the US for alleged war crimes in 1998. So his brother Hashim owns huge sections of the land that the new capital is going to be on, and it would seem that it was kind of like a political placebo that it happens to be in the same area. Luhut Panjaitan, who is the Minister for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, also owns huge swathes of land in East Kalimantan, as does Sintong Panjaitan, who's another very famous former military figure. So it was all of these people had land in, just happened to have land in an area that was earmarked for the new capital, right? So obviously this is a huge story. And we had all the documents, the land ownership documents. I worked with a group called Jatam in Kalimantan, who are the mining advocacy group. They gave us all the documents so that we had, proof that this was true. The publication that commissioned it, originally, they kept coming back to me again and again. They wanted the documents, they wanted them translated, they wanted this, they wanted that, they wanted more information, and finally, they just wouldn't do the story because they said it was too dangerous to do it. And this is a publication with huge amounts of money, with lawyers, and they just would not do it. And so what we did was we published it ourselves, but it went through Ranto to make sure that it was safe. And so this is what we've discovered by working together, is a way that works now if you want to get stories out about the environment or about anything that's a sensitive issue. I write the pieces, we research them together, we do our field work together, which is a very different model than most journalists use. You don't usually take a lawyer with you. But I think what we're moving towards now is it's becoming so dangerous to do stories, not just about the environment, but about lots of other things, that I really think that the model that we've developed together, which happened really by accident, is really the way forward, because it allows us to push further and further and further and to write things that are incredibly sensitive, but in a very kind of thoughtful way, where you come and do the field work with me, you see the situation on the ground, so it's not a lawyer sitting in an office somewhere like half the world away trying to understand the story that I've written. He comes with me and sees everything and then keeps me safe, both when I'm in the field but also when we publish, right? Do you want to explain a little bit about how you edit when I write? Like what you edit for, what you're looking for?
When I, as a journalist, write about environment and forest issue, I will ask her to make sure where she found the resource, make it as clear as possible, not just assumption. So when she write about 100 hectares damaged by this owner, the owner of the land, make sure where you get the resource. So that will make you safe, not assumption. So when we talk about the information, write where you get that information from, who you interview, who is the people who already interviewed by you. So not just your assumption. So it will make her safe in case company or individually powerful people in Indonesia sue her, so we can have a proof of everything that she write in her article.
You always say as well, you always say you soften it, but I don't think you mean, for me it's like, I don't think it's softening it in a way that takes anything away from the story. You change the language so that it's not quite legalese, it's not quite journalism, it's like a marrying of the two where we can't get sued for what we're writing, right?
Yeah, sometimes journalists write about something is just from her or his mindset, right?
Imagination, no,
yeah,
not quite, we don't quite do that. But
no, I mean, from your orientation.
From our background,
yeah.
you mean?
And when I read it, yeah. Why I say that softer? Because we talk about the interest of not only the interest of your article, but the interest of the people who live there. So when you write about the haze, not about the haze, not about the forest burn of the fire, but also because we must talk about the impact to the local people who live in the haze area. So maybe that you mean softer.
Yeah, I think you find a very clever way between, yeah, like I said, like citing parts of the law to keep me safe and changing the language that we're already using. Yeah, so the point being is that, you know, it's so difficult now to publish something like this. Even, I can't name the publication, but it was kind of amazing to me that they were too scared to take this. Although I remember when I gave it to you, you kept saying this is so dangerous as you were reading your way through it. But you found a way to allow me to publish it, right? Is there anything you wouldn't let me publish?
Yep.
Is there anything you would think would be like off limits, or can we just do anything?
Yeah, because we actually in Indonesia we have a law.
Yes.
It's called Information and Technology
Electronic transaction law.
Actually, this law is already made from 2007. Yeah, but the government more often to use that law now to sue or to send people to the jail because what they write about.
Online, it's specifically online.
Yes, online. So if you write something that you cannot prove where you get it, or you cannot prove it, is it true or fake, you will go to the jail because of that law. It's so easy.
And before, journalists used to be under the press law and were not supposed to be prosecuted under UUITE, right? And then now more and more journalists, they've kind of transferred it across to the UUITE law. So we should just be under the press law, which is a little bit, I would say, clearer for journalists. But now there's sort of this manipulation of the UUITE law that covers journalists.
Yeah. For the journalists, we have special law for the journalists. But when the journalist product or your article or your rating published into the online, it can sue by the ITE law. So it's the difference. So if you print your journalism article in the newspaper, it will under the press law. But if you publish it online through internet or through website, through your social media, it will under the ITE law, and it's more dangerous.
Yeah, it makes it a lot more dangerous because there are lots of different ways that they can now prosecute you for it. But you always say to me as well, I think this is kind of a contentious issue, but it means that because it's so difficult for journalists to publish things, becoming more and more difficult, journalists sometimes, will publish things anyway and put themselves in kind of a difficult situation. And you always say to me, we must fight the law with the law, right? Which you would say as a lawyer, I guess. But that's what our work allows us to do, is to use the law against the laws that are trying to stop journalists. And I really, really think that I would hope, we were very lucky to meet and to be able to do our work this way. But I genuinely think that if more journalists and lawyers could pair in this way, I really think that that's the way of keeping everybody safe and being able to push and publish as much as we want like this, which is something that's so difficult to publish otherwise. Sorry, I know we're like really, really running out of time. So this is so that we could start publishing what we wanted to publish. Like I told you, we made a newsletter called Hukum, where it was which is a place where we can put out stories that maybe other publications don't want to run because they don't have all the information. And then finally, just to end on, I guess, I hope a positive note after all the kind of doom and gloom about the future of journalism, the impact that we have been able to have through the work that we've done, because we've been able to push it further. We've been able to get out stories that have typically been off limits, been too sensitive, and there's different forms of impact in the work that we do. Do you want to do it? Do you want to speak first, or shall I, about Jambi? So, like Jambi, we went there because of the haze. So all the peatlands there were burning and the forest was burning. And what we've tried to do through our work in terms of the impact that we have as a journalist and lawyer team is to kind of try and do more and more community journalism. So what we did through New Narrative, which is the publication we mentioned at the beginning that we work for, is we put together a fundraiser to send money to Jambi for masks for all the people who were affected. So that's one way that, the environmental journalism that we've been able to do has kind of been able to have a measurable impact, I guess, because we were talking, Nora, before, right, about how it's kind of different. It can be difficult as a journalist to measure the impact that your work is having. And so we've tried to do more. We are trying to do more like that, right, about our environmental work. So it's not just we go into a place and get like these good quotes from, people who are suffering and then we leave. We try and do follow up with the community. Anything more about impact from your perspective?
Yeah, I want to say why we must fight the law with the law.
Okay.
Yeah, because nowadays, one farmer go to the court in Riau. He sue because he burned his land about 100 meters squares, and now he go to the jail because the government sue him, burn his land.
After the haze, like this?
Yeah.
Because they said
yeah,
he contributed
like
to the
like
haze.
this. Yeah. Nowadays, now he go to the court. Why we must fight the law with the law? Now, we believe he must go to the jail because the government must have justification because the haze, right? So the haze, not because the company, but because the indigenous people like this, like the men now in jail. So even though 1,000 journalism write about it, it will not influence what the judge decision to that man.
So you've got to keep writing more and more.
Yeah, we must fight the law with the law. Yeah.
And write more.
Yeah.
The law with the law or write more? I'm the journalist, so I'm going to say write more. That's okay. I think we've kind of really run over, and I apologize. Sorry. And we have a range of coupons, codes, by the way. If anyone wants to sign up to anything we do, just come and ask us afterwards. That's it. I'm sorry, I know we're super over. Do we want to go straight into the Q&A?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm actually not sure how much time we have. I haven't been able to. Oh, 15 minutes. Okay, great. So I guess I would like to start off. We heard a little bit of tension between fight law with the law versus maybe fight challenges through journalism and by exposing important issues. So I'm actually kind of curious, when you all think about the work that you do, what is the impact that you hope to have, and do you have any anecdotes where your journalism was powerful enough to either hold someone accountable or change a policy or an approach that an institution is taking? So I don't know if any of you want to start.
Who wants to start? I think it's a difficult question because, like, as a journalist, I try not to think about it, actually, which is maybe, like, a little bit of a disappointing answer. Like I said, we've done more and more work. We're trying to do more and more community work where we are kind of giving back after we do a story. But when you try, I don't know if my colleagues agree with me, but when you do a story and you start to think about the impact, especially stories like this, which are, covering such huge issues, I try not to think about what might happen. It's sort of like the best that I can do is write the story as best I can with you, and we try and push it as far as we can legally, and then put it out into the world and hope that people take something from it and hope that it does in some way affect change. But for me, if I think too much about that, it gets so much bigger than me. I don't know, Nellie's done so many big stories. I don't know how you feel.
Lo más difícil para lograr un impacto es la persistencia y el tiempo, y es lo que menos hay en los medios de los últimos años, ¿no? La crisis de los medios de comunicación ha llevado a cerrar coberturas, cancelar corresponsalías en el extranjero, eliminar unidades de investigación. Y lo interesante es que sí hay nuevos medios pequeños que están surgiendo en todo el mundo, que necesitan de su colaboración, pero también de la terquedad y la persistencia de periodistas, ¿no? O sea, lograr un impacto no es hacer una nota en un día y olvidarte de la historia. Requiere de la persistencia de 2, 3, a veces hasta 4 más tiempo, ¿no? 4 años, 5 años. Ahí me gusta mucho citar la historia de Loro, porque le tomó al equipo alrededor de 5 años de investigar el tema. La primera historia se publicó el 2010 y hasta el 2016 se continuó con la investigación hasta que el FBI se puso a investigar a una de estas empresas, ¿no? Y desde entonces nosotros no hemos dejado el tema. Ya vamos a cumplir casi 10 años investigándolo, y esa empresa ha cerrado, ¿no? Es interesante porque nadie se había puesto a investigar a la compañía. Por lo general el periodismo investiga, y está bien, a la corrupción, pero la corrupción requiere del otro poder, que es el poder corporativo y el poder privado. Y en muchos casos este otro poder usa armas legales, ¿no? Conocen el caso de Odebrecht y Lavajato. Odebrecht construyó un sistema legal que durante más de 10 años legalmente se apoderó de la mayor cantidad de obras públicas en América Latina y Angola. Entonces, lo que el periodismo requiere en este momento es enfatizar en estos grandes sistemas que incluso legalmente permiten expoliar recursos naturales de nuestros bosques, ¿no? Y del hábitat de las comunidades que viven dentro de ella. El impacto, yo creo que más importante que podría dar el periodismo de los últimos años es en denunciar cómo existe un sistema económico que está colapsado, ¿no? Detrás de la disputa por el territorio hay un sistema económico. Y no estoy reivindicando, ni me siento yo nunca ideológicamente cerca al socialismo, o sea, de hecho lo critico mucho, pero sí hay algo que es importante tener claro desde el periodismo, es que el problema de la situación en este momento, tanto para el clima como para la subsistencia de los bosques, es un sistema económico que genera un consumo desproporcionado de recursos que nuestros bosques no son capaces de soportar. Y ese es el gran tema, y es lo más difícil de hacerlo porque no hay un consenso incluso dentro del sector privado para reconocerlo, ¿no? Y esperemos que haya más historias de este tipo también, ¿no?
Thank you. I think it's probably a good time to switch to audience questions if anyone has any. I see a hand back there, and another one here in the middle. We're just waiting for microphones, sorry. And we can start here in the middle and then work our way back. Thanks.
water resources. That's important. And then the same happens in Ecuador.
Sí, hay dos cosas que creo que son importantes desde mi punto de vista en el medio en el que dirijo, ¿no? La primera es que América Latina necesita crecer más. O sea, la pobreza que hay en América Latina no se compara a la de los países del norte. Lo mismo sucede en África, incluso en la misma China, ¿no? Y para crecer tiene que hacer un uso responsable y sostenible de los recursos. El problema es en que los gobiernos no tienen idea en este momento de cómo va a ser este crecimiento. Y terminan cediendo a las presiones de los capitales. O sea, Perú, por ejemplo, igual que Bolivia, depende en gran parte de la industria extractiva. Y gran parte de la industria extractiva minera se concentra en las cabeceras de Cuenca, que es la parte más alta de los Andes peruanos, ¿no? El tema de ahí es cómo un país que depende de la minería en su crecimiento económico, protege la cabecera de Cuenca o las cuencas que garantizan el agua para su población. Y el dilema es enorme, es gigantesco. Y ahí uno esperaría un Estado fuerte que ordene esas prioridades, que no existe. ¿Qué hacer? Yo no lo sé, ¿no? Yo espero que los políticos de nuestros países, que son los profesionales en este tema, lo hagan, pero sí creo que no tenemos tiempo, ¿no? O sea, no hay tiempo y cada vez es más evidente el impacto de los ecosistemas dañados en nuestras vidas y la necesidad de crecer más, ¿no? Y lo que viene para los próximos años, yo lamentablemente soy un poco pesimista, hay un efecto Bolsonaro muy grande en América Latina, irradiado desde Brasil, pero también desde Estados Unidos, desde lo que viene en Europa, para hacer cada vez más un uso irresponsable de los recursos naturales, de los pocos ecosistemas que todavía nos quedan en diferentes partes del mundo. Y creo que sí es necesario por eso un grito desesperado hacia los consumidores, ¿no? Yo creo que por eso insistía y vuelvo a recordar que el periodismo tiene que empezar a denunciar qué es la demanda, ¿no? Quiénes consumen y apelar a que sea el consumo responsable lo que pueda detener esta gigantesca extracción de recursos, ¿no?
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I know there's a gentleman there who already has a microphone.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you deserve commendation for the great work you are doing. It's a lot of sacrifice for all of us. I don't know whether you've heard of the undercover journalist Anas Armiao from Ghana. He tried to use undercover journalist investigation into corruption of countries. So one way he proposed to make a far-reaching impact in terms of journalism is to pursue the information that you come out at the law court. So you come out with the findings, core evidence. So do you just leave the findings over there? So he's a lawyer, a trained lawyer. So he goes further to the law court to prosecute these people that he has found core evidence against. So I want to know whether some kind of this exemplary, journalism, core evidence and problem-driven solution is being practiced in other parts of the country where you do your journalism. And do you think undercover journalism has some ethical implication? And what are you doing to overcome those ethical issues?
Would you like to start?
Yeah, so it's a question in 2 parts. I'll answer the second part actually first, about the ethics of undercover journalism, because I think that's a very good question. I think journalism moves in phases, right? In some time, there was a time when that kind of undercover, sort of like gonzo journalism was kind of seen as you know, a good way of getting stories. I think nowadays it's becoming more and more problematic. I think you're right. I think there are ethical issues around undercover journalism. In some ways, it strikes very much the opposite to what you're trained to do as a journalist, which is you've got to tell people you're a journalist, right? So when you do undercover journalism, you're essentially going against your code of ethics, even though journalists don't have, you know, we don't have codes of ethics like lawyers do, right? They're much more kind of nebulous. But I think you've got to be very careful with undercover journalism. I think it's a boring answer to say it depends on a case-by-case basis, or maybe that sounds like a bit of a cop-out. I think it depends what it is. But ultimately, for me, I think undercover journalism is increasingly problematic from an ethical point of view. For me, personally, I would suggest. Do you want to answer the legal?
Yeah. In Indonesia, if we talk about undercover journalists, it's important if we talk about the life of people. For example, when this company opened this forest, 6 people died, but the company covered it, not publish it. It's important, and the people will talk about the undercover journalist when he say 6 people die when that company opened that forest. But if we talk about the damage of the forest, the damage of the environment, if we do it with undercover journalists, the people will not think it's important, because there is no people responsible with that information. Because in Indonesia, if we submit, for example, if we submit a report about, or if we submit complaint, it must clear who submitted, their identity, and other.
The first part of your question, I was just trying to understand, was it you were saying that there was a lawyer who was a journalist who was also prosecuting people?
Yeah, I want to know whether, like, he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
So finding core evidence, for example, if a mining company is violating national laws in terms of mining and saying they are not doing anything, I mean, you go to have like core evidence that this mining is really violating, you know, national laws, regulations. In the case of Nelly, so where like they do like dirty gold mining, those are in violation of certain national regulation. So when you get those core evidence, do you pursue those evidence at the law court against the company? You know, to have a far-reaching impact. You know, if you just find it, you know, sometimes you have to push the politician or the national government to the wall to take action. But if you come out with information and you leave it there without pursuing it at the law court, then they also kind of feel reluctant to take action. So I just want to know whether, you know, that kind of practice, I mean, whether it occurs in your country.
En realidad, la situación es tan urgente, es tan dramático lo que está ocurriendo en los últimos años, y como no hay tiempo, también el periodismo requiere situaciones y estrategias diferentes, ¿no? Por ejemplo, lo que ahora se está haciendo, y me parece que es saludable, es que exista un trabajo más colaborativo del periodismo de investigación con organizaciones que litigan, con organizaciones que hacen incidencia política, incidencia en la agenda pública también. Entonces, estas colaboraciones que logran que el periodismo publique la investigación, pero que luego esta otra organización con la que he tenido alianza se encargue del litigio, se encargue de hacer la incidencia en cuestiones políticas. Yo creo que eso es lo más saludable y lo más urgente también. Hasta hace unos años yo era muy incrédula de esta situación. Es más, yo sigo convencida de que el periodismo tiene que investigar y que el trabajo del periodista termina con la investigación y con el seguimiento de la investigación. Y la incidencia política es otro rol que le corresponde a la universidad, a los think tanks, a las ONGs u otros grupos. Pero en este momento pienso que una solución podría ser estas colaboraciones en la que el periodismo conserve su función de denunciar y de investigar, y que a través de estas alianzas sean estas otras organizaciones las que litiguen los casos y acompañen las denuncias. ¿Por qué? Porque es necesario hacerlo, sobre todo cuando las lógicas de la extracción de recursos tienen dinámicas que son legales, ¿no? Entonces, para pelear con la ley desde la ley, también es necesario entender que hay leyes que tienen aspiraciones de ilegalidad y de corrupción, como los paraísos fiscales, ¿no? Que son las offshore, son legales en todo el mundo, pero creo que hay un consenso internacional para cada vez ir eliminándolas, ¿no? Y las alianzas ahí son fundamentales, ¿no?
Hi, Pablo, my question's for you. I was wondering if you could speak about the tension of wanting more stories that are about Indigenous communities when their lives are being affected, but also having foreign journalists come in and try and maybe report those stories and not either like take advantage of Indigenous communities when they're reporting those stories, or not reporting them as they could be reported. And I was hoping you could talk about maybe some of that tension of foreign journalists trying to come in and tell those stories without having all of the knowledge.
The thing is that I think that one of the problems there is about parachute journalism. There's a lot of journalists that are working on these issues because in some way they are like trendy and they can find a way to sell these issues to big media outlets. And the thing here is that when you work with this kind of populations, and when you work with these issues, and we are talking about trying to show how big companies are destroying the rainforest, destroying these communities, or killing these people, as the colleague said, you are facing a lot of risks. But since you are a foreigner, since you are not from that place, and maybe you can have like international support, yes. You are not likely to be there, but you're not the first target. You don't have the support. And indigenous, for example, they are the target, and they don't have any kind of support. So I think that one of the problems there is that if you are not really engaged with what you are doing, and you are trying to sell a story because you work like doing these things, you can put at risk at these populations, because you go there, you don't get involved, you just make some interviews, go there, publish a story, and maybe you are publishing things that can put these people at risk because they are the ones that are in the field. So, for example, in my case, and many partners that work with these issues, we try to get the local people involved in the stories that we tell. And we try to, this collides in some way with this traditional impartiality, is that the word, about journalists. Because since you're dealing with these issues and working with people, you establish relationships, and then you are stepping in one side of the story. I mean, you see how companies behave on how they do illegal things, and they affect entire communities. So you try in some way to help these communities to get their voice, to turn the volume up on their voice so they can reach the media or whatever. And the thing is that if you don't let them to be part of this article, or if you don't let them to see what we are going to publish, maybe you can make mistakes, and maybe these mistakes are not just a mistake in a word that you read in an article. This mistake could cost the life of a leader. So I think that I don't know if that answers in some way your question, but I think that when we work in this, with these conflicts, it's really important that we take into consideration what the local people that you're talking about thinks about this.
Well, thank you again to our wonderful